Fat Moose Comics is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Established in 1982 and under new ownership since 2020, Moose sells a wide selection of comics from every publisher and time period, along with action figures, graphic novels, posters, statues, and more. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you're in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. Aw Yeah Comics celebrates and promotes everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations: Harrison, New York, aka my local comic shop, Skokie, Illinois, or Muncie, Indiana. If you have kids and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow Aw Yeah on social media for more. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw yeah. In the 1950s, George Reeves embodied the Man of Steel in Superman's first television adaptation, from its gritty black and white beginnings to the kid-friendly color years. To this day, an entire generation reveres George as their Superman, while for others, the show remains an overlooked chapter in the character's mythology. On this podcast, we bring everyone together as we break down each episode of Adventures of Superman. Welcome back to another exciting episode in the Adventures of Superman. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss Season 2, Episode 13, The Machine That Could Plot Crimes, is first-time guest Bruce Kanin. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Anthony. This is a pleasure. It really is.
It's an honor to have you here. You've been a vocal supporter of the podcast, and we've connected via social media, and I appreciate all of your support. And I'm especially happy to have you back here. This is our first episode following our mid-season hiatus. We covered Panic in the Sky, and then we took a little bit of time off, and now we're back to dive into the second half of Season 2. And I can't wait to get your thoughts on The Machine That Could Plot Crimes. But just more generally, I would love to hear about your fandom of, your experience with Adventures of Superman. How did you first meet the show, and what's resonated with you about it all these years?
Let me just first say, Panic in the Sky, this podcast is that's a tough act to follow. That was a great podcast. But anyway, to answer your question, so you'll kind of find out how old I am, kind of, sort of. My first encounter with Superman was around 1960, give or take. I'm sure I watched the TV series back then. I have really no memories of it, but I'm sure I did. But what happened was I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, first Crown Heights and then Canarsie, for anybody out there that knows where those neighborhoods are. And when we moved to Canarsie, I developed hay fever. And my mom had to schlep me across Brooklyn to downtown Brooklyn to get a hay fever shot once a month. And we would take the train. And when we transfer from one train to another, she let me go to a candy store that was on the street. And what was in the candy store? It had a spinner rack. And what did I do? I bought Superman, Action Comics, Superboy, Adventure Comics. I think that was it, because, they were expensive, 10 cents. Couldn't afford much more than that. Eventually, I branched out into World's Finest with Superman, Batman, etc. And then one day my parents threw my comic book collection out, and that's a story that a lot of people have. So,
I'm sorry to hear that, but I know you're not alone in that. I worked at my local comic shop for many years, and we hear stories like that all the time, unfortunately, for any number of reasons. Sometimes people had very difficult personal situations with family members or spouses. Other times it was just a lack of awareness about how much this meant to someone or the potential value that they could have in the future. But either way, it's a tough loss, I know.
Yeah, well, back then, I don't know how much people valued comic books. I had Mad magazines too, and they all went in the trash. And at the time, I wasn't as focused on them. This was more in the late 60s. And then when I got married, I bought them all back and then some. And I filled up a cedar closet in a basement I called the Fortress of Solitude. So I was okay in the end.
Excellent. All right. And then so when does the Reeves show really fully enter the equation for you?
During the 60s, it did, because I definitely watched it a lot in the 60s. I think it was on WPIX in New York. I think they showed that. and I watched all the episodes. They were all in black and white to me, even the color seasons, because we only had a black and white TV. Eventually, they were rerun later on Nick at Night, and I got back into them, and I I just loved it, and I was able to connect it up with a comic book. So I was in love with Superman. He's my favorite superhero. So
And so, what is it about the Reeves iteration in particular that resonates with you so much? I mean, clearly, this is a fandom that you've sustained now for decades, and you're active in the Facebook groups. You've participated in those Adventures of Superman luncheons that Jim Nolt organizes. When he was on, we talked about that. So, yeah, I mean, what is it that, again, I can probably guess, but I want to hear from you about what is it that has just grabbed you for all these years?
he was a no nonsense Superman. I mean, especially in the first and second seasons, and somewhat in the other seasons, but those are my favorite seasons. He was no nonsense. He wouldn't take any crap from anybody, and he was dead serious. His Clark Kent was as well. Yes, he had to occasionally show that he was a little different than Superman, a little weaker, a little more of a coward. Nothing like the Christopher Reeve Clark. Nothing against Christopher Reeve. I loved him, but George Reeves Clark Kent was great. The only one who comes closest is Dean Kane's Clark Kent. I thought he was really good. But that's a whole nother topic. I just, whenever George Reeves showed up on the scene, usually he's Superman, but even when he was Clark Kent, you knew everything's going to be all right. Unless he was in trouble, unless, like the defeat of Superman, he was felled by kryptonite or some other situation. So
Can you give me a little bit of a preview of what's in store for me when I get into the second half of the series, into the color years? Now, I have seen a fair amount of the color episodes, so I'm not going in blind, but I've not fully immersed myself in the color seasons yet. And I feel like I've seen Facebook comments of yours here and there, and I'm just curious if you could share kind of your assessment of where we're headed in the series.
I can only do that by giving you my summary of the seasons. And I know you've already gone through the first season and half of the second, but so second is my favorite. Second hits on all cylinders, and I can't leave out the soundtrack. The soundtrack is the best in the second season. In the second season, Superman's his life is in danger. His memory goes. His secret identity is in danger. Lots of great stories. And we'll talk about this one, which is a great episode, The Machine That Could Plot Crimes. First season is almost like a separate series to me. It's something different. I consider it to be the Earth 2 version of Adventures of Superman, whereas 2 through 6 is like the Earth 1 version. I actually did something for Jim Nolt's site about that. Anyway, what's in store? I hate to say it, but disappointment. It kicks off with, and I won't be too detailed because of time, but the machine that could plot, the Through the Time Barrier, the first episode of the color years, the third season, you think, wow, Through the Time Barrier, finally a time travel episode, but it's such a disappointment. And
I have seen that one, so I know exactly what you're talking about.
there are great episodes in seasons 3 through 5, but there aren't as many as there were in just season 2 alone. It's just geared more towards kids. There are silly episodes. There are more Lois and Jimmy adventures than Superman. Notice how I'm leaving out season 6.
Yes.
So 3 through 5, they're good, but not as great as what we had before. Season 6 is almost a return to season 2. It's great. It's got a lot of great episodes. Like Divide and Conquer is one of my favorite ones. It's really good. So hang on during the 3 through 5, and you'll get to 6, which is wistful because it's the last one. So.
All right. Well, I will go into those seasons with an open mind. And like I said, I've watched a fair selection of them already, including Divide and Conquer, including the episodes that George himself directed in the final season. So I would say I've surveyed the color seasons, right? And I kind of have a general sense, but I will go in with an open mind and just sort of take them for what they are. And I think what's particularly encouraging is that even though you have 3 seasons in the middle of the series, right, that didn't really do it for you the way the other ones did, that it doesn't seem to have diminished your love for the series overall or for this incarnation. I think that says a lot.
I will tell you that recently I watched the episode Joey, which I don't remember which season it's in. It's in the 3 to 5. It might be the third one. And I was pleasantly surprised. I really enjoyed it. I mean, it's a story about a horse. And that's how I remembered it as, horse, an elephant, the Prince Albert coat. But I watched it again, and I hadn't seen it in decades, and I really enjoyed it. So who knows? Maybe I'll watch a few more. I tend to think I'm not going to really like Mr. Zero in a rewatch, but you know what? You never know.
One of the things that I found on this podcast occasionally, but especially on my other show, Digging for Kryptonite, so many times I'll go back to something and I had one view of it the first time around and then I revisit it, and 9 times out of 10, my opinion improves. It rarely goes the other way. Most times I come away, enjoying it more than I did the previous time. So it's a wonderful part of this journey when that can happen.
It happens. It happens. It happens for me. It's happened with Star Trek and James Bond and other, fantasy genres. You go back and you see it again after a few years and you say, this wasn't bad.
Yeah.
You wonder why you didn't like it in the first place, but you kind of forget.
I guess my last preliminary question, and then we'll get into the machine that could plot crimes. But in speaking with or interacting with online other George Reeves Superman fans, I know there are a fair number for whom George is it, right? Like Superman begins and ends with George Reeves. And then others who have followed the S, to quote our friend Ed Gross, have followed the S across time and media. Maybe I already have my answer because you mentioned Dean Cain, you mentioned Christopher Reeve, you mentioned the comics. So, do you fall into that camp of George is your favorite, but you've still explored the wider mythology?
So let me answer you this way. There are some fans, and I've encountered them in Jim's great Facebook group, who, I don't want to say this the wrong way, but George is the only guy. They won't consider anybody else. And I like to think I have an open mind, and I think I have, because I loved Christopher Reeve. I like Dean Cain as actually more as Clark than Superman, but I love the show, Lois and Clark. I found things to like in all of them, some more than others. So I have an open mind. I am grateful to have another incarnation of Superman, whether it's on TV or in the movies. I can't wait for James Gunn's new movie. When is it? Next year? I just can't wait. So, and what I've seen of it, I'm thrilled. So
great. No, I think that's a very healthy, that's a very healthy outlook to have. So that's fantastic. Wait, I actually did have yet one more question, and then we really will get into this episode. But I know we're focusing on the positive and all that, and not to turn this negative, but I'm just curious, as someone who's followed the show and thought about the show for so long, what's on your wish list of things that you wish the show had gotten to do or hadn't done or had done more of? What comes to mind in that realm?
How much time do you have?
Hey man, we can go as long as you want.
Well, so I don't want to sound conceited, but I'm kind of prolific with like some of the graphics, and I created these. I don't know if you remember TV Guide used to have these close-ups years ago, and I created a lot of TV Guide close-ups, imagining a 7th, 8th, and 9th season of The Adventures of Superman. Anyway, to answer your question, my wish list would be the Silver Age. Bring in elements of the Silver Age. Bring in Red Kryptonite. Bring in, oh my God, Lex Luthor. They could have brought back Lyle Talbot from the serial. He would have made a great Luthor in the series. So many other things that I'm not the Phantom Zone, Bizarro, the things that the great Superboy series did. And I know you've had podcasts about it that I'm behind in, and that series did tap into the Silver Age very nicely. So many things, but that's what I would love to have seen. So,
yeah, to see George play Clark / Superman on Red Kryptonite would have been amazing, regardless of which track they took with Red Kryptonite, because that can go in any number of directions. But especially if they went with, quote unquote, bad Clark or something along those lines. And I agree wholeheartedly about Lex, and that's come up numerous times in our discussions. It's just kind of, it just feels so perplexing because you mentioned Lyle Talbot. It's like the character had been brought to life on screen in the serials not that long before, so there was a precedent for it. Yeah. No special effects needed, and it just felt like he was right there. And to kind of have him as the series big bad, even if he only pops up once or twice a season, just to kind of tie everything together in a way, or just kind of put something behind some of the proceedings. I know it can't help but feel like a missed opportunity to me as well.
You mentioned good and bad Clark. So as you know, Superman 3 did that. They had good Clark versus evil Superman. Just wish instead of that synthetic green kryptonite, they would have colored it red. It would have made so much sense. But that was one of the good parts of that half-baked film. But they did it. At least they did it, not the series.
I know. I know, it's true. We had a version of that in Superman 3. Lois and Clark did Red Kryptonite. The Superboy show did Red Kryptonite. Smallville did a lot of Red Kryptonite. So,
yeah, Smallville OD'd on Kryptonite in general, but that's another story.
But no, it's great getting your perspective on the series as a whole. And now let's shift into The Machine That Could Plot Crimes. December 12th, 1953, written by Jackson Gillis, directed by Tommy Carr. I'll give my synopsis, and then we'll break it all down. Criminal Larry McCoy takes advantage of eccentric inventor Uncle Oscar and his advanced machine that thinks, aka Mr. Kelso, using it to perform a series of perfectly timed and coordinated bank robberies. The supercomputer even seemingly outwits Superman by sending a message to the Daily Planet that Superman's secret identity will be revealed if he interferes. Ultimately, Clark realizes this was a bluff after he and Lois are abducted and he is not recognized. In the back of the getaway vehicle, Clark knocks out Larry and, as Superman, rescues Oscar, just as Mr. Kelso sends the getaway vehicle down a one-way street and toward a waiting police officer. So when I initially reached out to you about joining me for an episode on here, that this was an episode, I believe I gave you a choice. I can't remember now, but I think I gave you a choice, and this was the one that you jumped on. So what was it about this episode that made you jump on it?
My career was in IT. So what is Mr. Kelso? He's a big computer. So I thought, why not? I have that connection. Why not talk about this episode, which I really enjoyed? So that's probably what nailed it.
Very nice. I got to tell you, I didn't remember much about this going in, just really the broadest strokes about it. And I really enjoyed it. It had, to me, kind of a season 1 feel to it to an extent. And even though you have this advanced technology here, but even then it felt kind of in keeping with something like the Mind Machine from the first season.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. I'm going to digress for just a second.
Please go for it.
I'm going to say, so I'm a huge James Bond fan. I was an aficionado of the Ian Fleming James Bond novels. And there was a phenomenon that others called the Fleming sweep, which was basically that in the James Bond novels, they would never stay in one place for very long. They wouldn't get bogged down. Fleming kept the plot moving. And The Machine That Could Plot Crimes, via the great Jackson Gillis, who was one of the best TV scribes around, he kept this episode moving. There are key plot points where the episode pivots, and then it moves to the next situation, and you can feel it just watching it. It's growing, it's building, it's moving, and that made it great. It really did. It's not Panic in the Sky, but that's the gold standard. It's maybe a notch below that. It's still great, though.
I agree. No, and in fairness to this episode, I was thinking about it, to have to follow Panic in the Sky, no easy thing, but no, I really enjoyed this one. You're right. I mean, it really does move. Like I said, it kind of had that season 1 feel. It introduces Sterling Holloway here as Uncle Oscar. Now, I want to get your take on this actor generally. Of course, I noticed that he was the voice of Winnie the Pooh among a long list of credits. And of course, as I'm watching it, I was like, I'm hearing Winnie the Pooh in my head. But so I'm curious, I welcome any thoughts you have about Sterling Holloway generally. I guess the question I have for you, I know he comes back as the same character later in season 2. Then in Through the Time Barrier at the start of season 3, the actor is back as a different scientist. What,
Professor Whittle,
yeah,
right?
I mean, do you have any sense of why they didn't have him return as his same character since we're still dealing with a scientist?
I don't know. I really don't have a theory on that. It was a different situation. It was a time machine, but he was still an absent-minded, eccentric professor. So they could have easily made him, quote unquote, Uncle Oscar, Professor Quinn, in Through the Time Barrier. I don't have an idea, but it's kind of nice that in The Whistling Bird they brought him back. He was basically the same character. You got to love his voice, whether you know that he did Winnie the Pooh or not. He's got such a great voice, and his attitude is he's very kind of soft-hearted, kind-hearted, and he's such a likable character. He's a likable actor too.
Yeah, yeah, you really do feel for him in this when Larry takes advantage of him and this machine, and I mean we'll get to it, but when Superman shows up and he actually helps Superman by tripping the accomplice of Larry's who's there. So yeah, he was great in this. I'm looking forward to rewatching his next appearance when we get to that later in the season. And then I know, of
Mhm.
course, as we get deeper into the series, we have Pepperwinkle.
I didn't like him as much. I mean, Pepperwinkle was okay, but why don't I like him as much? Well, which seasons did he appear in? In the color years, he was just goofier. His inventions were sillier. Some of them were interesting. He invented a matter transporter before Star Trek did, in the phony, I think it was the phony alibi. But he was okay, but he seemed a little too comical. So.
Yeah, yeah. I wish Oscar could have been a more sustained presence. On the note of our guest cast, so interestingly here we have Billy Nelson as Larry McCoy and Ben Weldon as Nosy. Both of them, we just saw them a few episodes ago in The Dog Who Knew Superman, and there the
Right.
dynamic was flipped, where the one here who is the henchman or the accomplice was the ringleader and vice versa. So it was interesting to see the pair, like the same pair from that episode brought back, but to have their dynamic inverted. But I think it's a testament to the strength of these character actors who came through the show, where you buy them in these different roles and they're as believable in these different forms. But it was particularly striking that we had this same pair from that episode.
They were wonderful. There are others, and I have a brain freeze. I don't remember the others, but they were great. Their Brooklyn accents were so funny. And yes, they would flip roles. One of them would be the head guy, and the other would be the henchman. You know, I know you're aware of it's almost like the Lost episode, Stamp Day for Superman. I believe that Billy Nelson is in that as well. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure he's in it. And even there, he plays an almost likable but murderous henchman. I mean, he threatens to kill Lois Lane in that, but he's kind of nonchalant about it. And he's the same in this episode. So,
Yeah, and we will be covering Stamp Day for Superman when we get to the end of season 2. So that is
right.
coming. Before we get into kind of our scene by scene discussion here, any other overall thoughts about this episode that you want to share before we dive in more specifically?
I think I've mentioned a few. I'm trying to think of anything else I would want to say. Oh, well, I have lots to say about this being a secret identity episode. There are so many, well, maybe not so many, but there are a handful of Adventures of Superman episodes that are basically about Superman's secret identity being in jeopardy. The ultimate one being Stolen Costume. And your podcast was great. It was fascinating. It's funny. And also the other one that you did, Shot in the Dark, that was all about Superman's secret identity. And typically when you have his identity in jeopardy, that kind of raises the level of the episode to be even more interesting because and they never really talk about why he needs a secret identity, why it's so critical for him to have it. There's in Silver Age Action Comics 305. I remember this because I had it before it was thrown out, I guess. Um, it's the cover story is why Superman needs a secret identity, and it's a great story. People should pick it up if they don't have it. But anyway, you think about a secret identity, it's there to protect his people he knows, his loved ones and his friends from attack from criminals. Plus, he grew up as Clark Kent, so he really is Clark Kent, as opposed to Superman, which I feel is just his disguise. So it really isn't talked about much. Why his identity is important. It's just assumed that the viewer will say, well, yeah, he's got to be Clark Kent and Superman. So they never really get into that.
The other kind of big picture thing that jumped out at me about this episode that I found particularly striking and timely, when Uncle Oscar is explaining this machine that he's created, he's like, it's a machine that can think. And it's like AI. I mean, it's what we're, what we're contending with now, this ongoing issue. And I was like, wow,
Yeah.
like that was really fascinating.
Yes, yes. What's funny too is that when Uncle Oscar explains it to Larry McCoy at the beginning, McCoy goes, "Oh, it's like what they use for elections." And I'm thinking, did they use them for elections? I guess they did. This was 1953, and you have to put yourself in the picture of 1953. What were computers like back then? Was this realistic for Mr. Kelso to actually exist? And who knows? Who knows? There's an element of fantasy here, but there was that aspect too.
I will say that, yes, I agree. Definitely an element of fantasy, but this did not stretch the suspension of disbelief as much as the Mind Machine did. And I love the Mind Machine episode, but there it's like, okay, I mean, that's really a stretch. So here I felt like this was more within the realm of possibility, that you feed in all of this information, all this data to the machine, and it can spit out these answers for you. It's like, I can get on board with that.
Well, even Clark kind of boils it down in the early scene with Henderson and Lois at police headquarters when his supermind says, "Oh, it sounds like they've boiled it down to a formula." Now, they don't know that it's a computer. Clark doesn't even know it's a computer, but he's hot on the trail. There's something going on, and he says it's a formula. So he's beginning to make sense of it.
Filmmakers and movie fans alike should be sure to attend these film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and Round Reel in Bloomfield, New Jersey. Take it from an alum of two of them. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news about events, discounts, tickets, and more. Also, listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network. Creator and podcaster Perry Constantine, host of Superhero Cinephiles, has a special offer for listeners of this podcast. Visit percivalconstantine.com/DFK or click the link in the show notes. Fill out the form and then get 2 free novels and 1 free superhero short story. The novels are Vanguard, Heroes Forged, an Avengers-inspired team of superheroes, and Ronin Born, a cyberpunk superhero novel set in a futuristic, fascist Japan. The short story is Omega Knights, Fire and Lightning, a Power Rangers-inspired prequel to an upcoming serial. Take advantage of this offer today, and be sure to catch Superhero Cinephiles on all major podcast platforms. We reference the television series Smallville a lot around here, and there's one Smallville rewatch podcast that's always at the top of my queue: Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring tremendous insight, passion, and humor as they discuss each and every episode of the series that ushered in the renaissance of superhero TV. Listen to Always Hold On to Smallville wherever you get podcasts, and keep an eye out for the other shows under the Always Hold On to banner, including Arrow, DC's Legends of Tomorrow, Superman and Lois, and Star Wars. Yeah. All right. Shall we dive into our scene by scene
Really?
discussion here? One of the other things as we're starting that I noticed, it's fairly deep into the episode before we get to our main cast, right? Because we have, I think, 3 scenes here. We open on Larry, and then we go up to Uncle Oscar's place, and then we see the first bank robbery. So it's a little while before we get to our crew, but definitely holds your interest as you're getting into it here. And so we open on Larry McCoy in his apartment. He gets up, he goes to the window, he lights up a cigarette, which again, it's always amazing. You know, these days you never see anyone smoking on television. So you had that. And he turns on the radio, and what timing? He's listening to the radio just as the announcer is talking about, like, well, what happened to all these guys like Larry McCoy that basically with Superman around, they've been run out of town and they're not up to their old tricks the way they used to be. And this really frustrates Larry. And boy, does he smash that radio.
How often does it happen on a TV show where there's a situation and then someone flips on the TV and that situation is being talked about right then and there? I mean, that's exactly what happens here. You hear this announcer talking about how criminals are downtrodden, they're being run out of town, et cetera, because of Superman. And then he mentions Larry McCoy's actual name, and Larry looks up and what's going on? And then he smashes his radio. And very funny. And it almost seems like it's setting up a funny episode, but it's not. It's very serious.
No. Now, I didn't go frame by frame, but it looks like, I feel like the radio shatters before it even hits the floor, right? I feel like as soon as he smacks it, I feel like it just kind of...
I'll have to go back and look at that.
But that's our introduction to the character we will come to know as Larry McCoy. And he can't go back to sleep because he's hearing this racket from upstairs. And so he goes and he encounters his neighbor in this building, Uncle Oscar or Professor Oscar. What was the name? Quinn, right?
Professor Quinn, Uncle Oscar.
Right.
Yeah, I use the names interchangeably.
And of course he sees this contraption, this giant machine. And Oscar's explaining, he's very proud of this. And let me ask you, just from a prop standpoint, you know, what did you make of what they came up with to represent this machine? Because I thought it was pretty impressive.
Very impressive. I mean, it's huge. It fills up half the apartment. I mean, I think it fills up one whole wall, and then it extends along another wall. And it's run by, you feed it instructions with a microphone, and then a paper tape comes out. In my earliest days in IT, I used the paper tape, but I never talked to a computer. And actually, if you think about that, that's like Siri.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, like that's the thing that it's just funny to see those, those connection points to what our life is now and the technology that we use and the issues that are at play. Just to see them represented in this episode from 1953.
Well, we could have an app on our smartphones called Mr. Kelso at this point. So,
very true. Yes, and Oscar introduces this contraption as Mr. Kelso, and again explains that the machine can think. And what really gets Larry's attention is when Oscar starts talking about safe combinations, right? And the wheels start turning.
Right. Well, Larry McCoy just wanted to get back to sleep. He's headed out the door, but then he suddenly hears safe combinations when the guard is stationed, police. I forget exactly what, but it's suddenly Uncle Oscar is speaking McCoy's language, which is, and you can see the light bulb go off over his head, figuratively speaking, that, wait a minute, I can use Mr. Kelso. So that was great.
Yeah.
And that's a focal point for the episode, a turning point, because it leads to everything else.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, through this machine, Larry and his accomplice, like they're able to, again, pull off these perfectly timed robberies where everything is lining up in terms of the guards at the bank and the police officers and the traffic lights. I mean, everything is perfectly timed because of these instructions that they're getting from the machine. And I forget exactly what Oscar was doing, when he first has that interaction with McCoy. It was like a friend of his who was a guard at a bank and was trying to figure out if he had enough time to check in or something like that?
Right. After Quinn says, "Oh, I'm looking at the safe combinations and the bank timings, etc." If he then says, "Oh, I have a friend who's in the business and he needs to know some things," they had to put that in. Otherwise, why would was Quinn a criminal too? Why was he looking at that? So they had to throw that in, and that was kind of smart that they did.
Yeah, and it was I also what I one of the things I liked about this episode was that Oscar was so sweet and innocent, right? It's not like he had devised this for any nefarious purposes. That he is unwittingly taken advantage of by McCoy, but also that I don't know, just to kind of change things up. It's not. I mean, we get to the point where they punch him out and tie him up, but it's not like they're forcing him to do this at gunpoint the whole episode, right? It's this idea that he's just this unwitting part in this scheme. So I like that angle there, a little different.
Well, they kind of had to do that because McCoy wasn't going to figure out how Kelso worked right at the get-go. He had to watch Uncle Oscar. And remember, there's an exchange where I can't remember the dialogue where McCoy says something like, "Oh, I just, because he mentions these things that he wants Kelso to look up, and he says, of course, this if I was a criminal, this would be a bad thing, but we're not criminals." And I think Uncle Oscar takes his glasses off. "Oh, yeah, we're not criminals." Or that would be, I forget what the dialogue is, but it's a cute scene.
Yes.
So I took my glasses off.
Yeah. Well, Uncle Oscar, those glasses were coming on and off throughout that scene.
Yes.
A nice bit of business for the actor, the glasses on and off.
That's great. Nice prop.
Yes. And from there, we see then the accomplice, Nosy, pulling off the first bank robbery. So it's a success. And then at last, we catch up with Henderson, Lois, and Clark talking about this robbery. And Henderson, as always, he's not pleased with the press about these headlines regarding the bank robbery. And just even the implication that this is the start of something larger. And they're trying to figure out what's going on. And you were just mentioning this a moment ago, but, Clark is really kind of piecing together. He doesn't know the full picture. He doesn't know this machine or anything like that. But this idea that there's some larger plot at play, like that there actually was some coordination here. It wasn't a coincidence that the timing happened to be just perfect.
But Henderson does kind of cool Clark off by saying, "Yeah, but," after Clark says they've got it down to a formula, Henderson says, "Yeah, but you'd need a really big brain or something like that for that." And Clark says, "Yeah, I guess you're right." So but that still, Clark is already on the trail. It's clear that he is.
Well, Clark has proven himself more so than Henderson, I'm sorry, has proven himself, to be a little bit more of a critical outside the box thinker, right? Entertaining the notion that something more could be afoot. But in Henderson's defense, and Clark's as well, because like you said, I think he does cool Clark off a little bit, who could foresee the machine that could plot crimes, right? Like they wouldn't have anything that they could even kind of point to as an example of something that could do this. So I get why it wouldn't be their first guess.
1953, how many computers were in use? How many people knew what a computer was? So they weren't going to think about this back then. Not yet.
Yeah. But again, I like the fact that Clark was just, again, thinking outside the box, that maybe there's something more that could be going. And then they get interrupted because now the second national bank in Metropolis has been robbed. And then we have this whole montage, right, of continued robberies and all of the headlines, and Larry and his henchmen, they're using the name Kelso. So we have Kelso splattered across the newspapers.
Well, what happened, if I remember correctly, Nosy, Ben Weldon's character, was on his own. I think he was sitting in his car or outside the car, and a bystander came by, and there was some exchange when Nosy says, "Oh, it's Mr. Kelso who robbed the bank," something like that. And from that point on, it makes it to the newspapers so that the headlines all say Kelso robbery, etc. So at least, which is good. And they needed to do that to give the robberies or the crimes a name. So
if Uncle Oscar were a little bit more up on his current events, he might have he might have figured out how the machine was being used a little bit sooner. It takes a little. Eventually, it gets there, but I know it takes a little while.
I guess he doesn't have a paper delivery.
I know. Well, he's got other things on his mind, in fairness, right? He's clearly, you get the sense he has a very single-minded focus on his scientific pursuits. Right. So we have this whole montage. These robberies are being committed. And then we see Clark in his office. He hears another alarm and changes to Superman and is able to grab the guy. But when he opens up this bag expecting to find the stolen loot, instead it's shirts. So they got one over on him, which again, I think really shows the ingenuity of this crew.
And as we learn a little bit later, it was a decoy because Larry McCoy had the real bag of cash. But that scene is wonderful because when a few things I want to say about it. One is when Superman opens the bag and you see laundry, it's like, what? And his expression, George Reeves' expression, is priceless because it's kind of like a smirk, and not quite a smirk, but it's like a look of frustration. And it's almost like he's thinking, well, they put one over on me of all people. And you even see Ben Weldon's expression, Nosy, is funny too, because he's got a look of shock because he didn't know. He thought he had robbed cash and he had laundry in there. So great scene. The other thing I wanted to say real quick is that sometimes the series doesn't show the power of Superman. In this case, he could have X-rayed that bag. I mean, it wasn't made of lead. But had they done that, it would have taken all this fun out of it. We wouldn't have gotten that expression by George Reeves, and would have been different. He could have X-rayed the bag and then just not even bothered with it. But they did a better job the way they did it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't think Nosy agrees, right? He didn't love being used as the decoy in that. And that leads us to our next scene back at Oscar's apartment. And this is where now Oscar realizes what's been going on and Larry punches him out.
Well, let me just say, so just before that, though, it's kind of a pivotal moment because Nosy wants to leave. Nosy saw Superman there. He was right up next to Superman. And Nosy he says that he's very afraid of Superman. He's out. He heads towards the door, but McCoy stops him. And that's what makes McCoy realize he has to get Kelso. I know you're about to cover this, but he's got to get Kelso to stop Superman. And that's when he, as you said, he knocks out. So kind of a jarring moment. Nice Uncle Oscar, he's knocked out. Fortunately, you don't see him hit the floor.
True. But still, that was a lot for season 2. And we'll get to Clark knocking out Larry later on in the episode. And I said, oh, that's, again, another reason why I said it feels like season 1, because we haven't been seeing too many punches thrown in season 2 so far.
That's a good point. That's true.
But yeah, no, you laid it out perfectly right now. This idea of using Kelso to keep Superman at bay, right? And this then leads to probably the most intriguing part of this episode where they're committing their next robbery. And as they're making their getaway, there's a truck that's in the way and Superman shows up and Superman moves the truck out of their way so they can drive on by. And of course, in the subsequent scenes, we'll find out why he did that. But I thought it was clever and like really holds your interest of like what exactly is going on here. Why, why would Superman be aiding them in any way? So I like the way that played out.
We suddenly have a mystery. Why is Superman doing that? And it's in full view of the police because when the police show up, they're firing at McCoy and company. And then once Superman allows McCoy, and they're driving a bank panel truck or a bank security truck, and they're able to get away. And they focus on a cop who, I mean, he doesn't have any expression, but you can see he's taking it all in. Superman helping the crooks. What's going on?
Yeah. Now, of course, as Superman fans, we know there's a reason and it'll all be explained. But yeah, I liked the way that this was set up here. And the other thing that stood out about this episode, a lot of exterior shooting, which I thought was great. And it was really striking in this episode, a significant amount.
I think they had more exterior shooting, and this was in some Los Angeles industrial area, than they've had in any other episode. I mean, there's a lot of it. Virtually every bank robbery scene, and then what we're about to discuss is in some industrial area of LA, and it was great. I mean, we got out of the stuffy Daily Planet offices and police headquarters. We got into the great outdoors of LA, and it was wonderful.
Yeah, I feel like it gave a scope to the episode beyond what you typically have. So it really stood out. It added a lot of value to it, I thought.
Yeah, yeah.
From there, we're back at the Daily Planet, and Lois and Jimmy are very befuddled by Superman's actions here. They've heard about what happened and can't figure it out, and they decide to go talk to Clark about it. Clark is in his office, or comes into his office, and we see him pull a piece of paper out of his desk, and he's looking at it. And then when he realizes Lois and Jimmy are coming in, he hides it right under something on his desk. Which, as we get to the end of the season, and not season, end of the scene, after Clark leaves, Lois will very quickly find it. My question for you: Did Clark want her to find it? Yeah, go for it.
I don't think he necessarily wanted her to find it. My take on this, because I thought first it was careless writing, and then I thought, no, Clark is upset because, and we talked about it, his secret identity was in jeopardy. So, he may be Superman, he may have a super mind, but he can make mistakes. He has. There have been episodes where he has. I mean, he left Connie and Ace and Connie on the top of a mountain. Probably shouldn't have done that. Another story, which you covered. But he's upset. He's troubled, and he's focused on finding out who is saying that they know his secret identity. So, and she and Jimmy came in quickly. So he just, he couldn't use his super speed to hide it in his in his desk drawer. So he just put it behind him, hoping, I guess, or even not thinking about it. So yeah. I want to comment on Jimmy, because Jimmy's hardly in this episode. And one might say, oh, why did they even bother with him? Jack Larson. I love Jack Larson. I met him at one of the Jim Nolt Superfests in 2014, but that's an aside. Why was he in this episode? He was there for about a minute or two. The answer is, well, we're about to cover it, but Lois needs someone to explain things to. And she couldn't do it without anybody in the room. She couldn't have a thought bubble above her head. So that's why he was in it, but he was quickly gone after that.
Yeah, very minimal presence. Yeah, the only other way would have been Lois reading the letter aloud to herself. But, there's an awkwardness to that. So, yeah, I think Jimmy serves exactly the function you described. And I also, I really do like your read on Clark in that scene because, again, the way it plays, like I said, I did have that thought of like, well, did he want her to find the note? But it's like, why would he? Wouldn't make any sense. But I like, and I agree with your read that he was a bit flustered and a bit out of sorts because there was this potential threat to his identity. And so he wasn't being as careful as he otherwise might have been. And as we've been alluding to, after he leaves and Lois quickly finds that message that had been sent by McCoy to the Daily Planet for Superman, stated that the machine had deduced his secret identity and it would be revealed if he interfered with these robberies. So we really raised the stakes here.
There are two aspects to that scene with regard to Lois, though, Noel Neal's Lois Lane, which I find fascinating. One is that at first she says, that Clark Kent stealing notes meant for Superman, which I find is funny because in other episodes, she thinks that they're one and the same. Here, she thinks they're two different people. But then there's another aspect to this, and that's she shows real concern for Superman. She's concerned that his secret will be exposed. And my thought there is that, well, she's in love with him. And she knows how much, as well, perhaps more importantly, how much he means to the world. And maybe she even understands how important his secret identity is to him. So that's seemingly a rare moment of concern because in other episodes, and even as we'll learn later in this episode, she wants to know his secret identity. So here she's concerned, and that's a great moment for her. Um, but then I'll just close this with, at the end of that scene, she says something like, "Well, if Clark Kent thinks he's going to get a scoop on me, he's got another thing coming," something like that, before she leaves. So she's like all over the place.
From the scene in the Daily Planet, we go to this industrial area that we've been talking about where Clark is on the trail. We see him using his X-ray vision, and he has found the getaway vehicle. Now, how he knew where to go, I don't know. But I mean, in theory, he could have followed them after the robbery that he, quote unquote, aided them in.
I have a theory. I thought about this after rewatching the episode, and it's basically, well, he went back to the area where Superman appeared, moved that truck out of the way, etc. He went back to the general area, and you have to assume, half-hour show, maybe he spent some more time walking around that industrial area, and that's when he, as you said, he X-rayed a garage and saw that panel truck or the bank truck. So I'm sure that's what happened. That's very rational. So it can be explained.
Well, and I think it makes total sense for his character, right? Because yes, he wants to protect his secret identity, but at the same time, he still wouldn't take any unnecessary risks towards civilians, right? So he probably would have kept tabs on these guys after they drove away to make sure that they weren't doing anything else. So the idea that he would have either directly followed them or scanned the area or done something such that he knew, okay, like they're here, they're laying low, they're not hurting anybody. I can buy that.
It's all very plausible. It's nothing that you say, well, how did he do that? No, that makes sense.
And then, of course, Lois is following Clark, and she gets nabbed. And then Clark comes around, and he's held at gunpoint as well. And he's very awkward in this scene, right? Because he doesn't know if they have actually deduced his identity yet, right? And so he's kind of like hiding his face. And Lois is really frustrated with Clark at one point. She's like, "Do something," which, I mean, in fairness, they're being held at gunpoint. I mean, I don't know how much you want to do necessarily. I felt for Clark in that moment. Yeah.
No, I have to say, so when Lois is nabbed by Mousy, she's strolling along, and then Mousy comes out of nowhere and grabs her. She gives off a scream, and who did I think of? I thought of Phyllis Coates.
Yeah.
I tried to compare her scream with Phyllis Coates' scream. Then I was reminded of your chat in Panic in the Sky, where you compared the two Loises. And that's something that would be great to do every now and then, to say, oh, what if Phyllis Coates was in this episode? How would she have done? I think she would have done great, for the reason you mentioned, that it has a season one feel. But anyway, that's an aside.
No, but it is a great point. But then it is in this scene, right, where Clark does have that moment of realization that he is not recognized. And I think from this point forward, in the rest of what we see of Clark, there is such a calm that comes over him when he and Lois are tied up, then when he's in the back of the van with McCoy. And I loved the vibe of those scenes and the way George Reeves played it, where, he's got this well in hand, and it's just, you see again that earlier flustered sense about Clark when he didn't realize, and then now this calm when he realizes, no, this was a bluff. They don't actually know who I am. And again, it's not anything that he articulates explicitly, but you see it in his demeanor.
Well, the thing is, McCoy says to Clark, and when they're at gunpoint, he says, "Oh, I know all about you," to Clark. And Clark is like, "What do you mean? You know all about me like I'm Superman." He doesn't say that. And all McCoy says is that you're one of those nosy reporters. And that's another pivot, because then you see a little smile. He cracks a little smile. Then it's a bigger smile, and then a huge belly laugh. And George Reeves handled that beautifully. And as you said, the tone of the episode changed at that moment, because he knew, oh, it was a bluff. They don't know my secret. So that was great. That was beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the stolen costume and the cabin, and this has become a running gag on the podcast here about this village in the mountains growing as Superman brings people there. And yeah, I mean, for everyone's sake, it's a good thing that Mr. Kelso had not actually deduced Superman's secret identity, because McCoy, Nosy, the other guy, what Mousy, Pinky, whatever his name is, Oscar himself, they all have been up in the mountains. So it worked out well for everyone.
Superman would have had to build like a Holiday Inn or something up there.
Absolutely. So we get to the climax of the episode where we have Lois in the front of the getaway vehicle with Nosy, and Clark in the back with McCoy. And again, as cool as a cucumber, Clark Kent in the back of that van, and essentially getting McCoy to spill the beans about what their plan is. What their plan is to kill Oscar and destroy this machine and escape with all of this loot. And McCoy makes the point of like, this is everything that's in the van. This is all of it. This is all the loot that they've stolen. And once Oscar and Lois and Clark and the machine are all taken care of, they're out of there. Of course, he won't get to that.
A scene just before they go in the van, Lois and Clark are tied up and they're in a warehouse. And then McCoy and Nosy walk away. And Lois is still upset. You see, Clark may be relieved, but Lois isn't. Like, what's going to happen to us, Clark? And it's so funny because Clark then goes, and his voice is like so relaxed. Don't worry, Lois. Superman's going to rescue us. He's got it all figured out. We're going to be fine. It was only a bluff. And you don't get Lois saying, well, how do you know all that? It's a great scene, and you can see how relaxed. And George Reeves does such a good job because he's turned on a dime now to being a really relaxed Clark Kent, and it's neat.
Yeah, I think he says like Superman will rescue us as soon as he can, which is literally true. And
Right.
later in the episode, I'm jumping ahead a bit, but when Lois questions Clark about how he escaped from the truck, and he's like, Superman, busted a hole through it. And it's like, yes, that is true. The fact that he is Superman is left out, but it is true.
Incidental. But the thing about the series, and this is throughout the series, is that Superman and Clark cannot tell a lie. There may have been some where he tells a white lie, a fib, whatever, but I think as like a lesson to kids, they and adults, they avoided having him tell a lie, because that would kind of be against one of his commandments, I guess, or a TV commandment to have a main character, the star, be a liar. So, but what he does is he deceives. He points people in the wrong direction. And in this case, as you said, he says, well, Superman rescued me, which is absolutely true. He could have also said, he rescued myself. That's me. So...
Yeah, absolutely. But in the back of that truck, Clark distracts McCoy and then pushes him down. And then in the front of the truck, Lois and Nosy hear a commotion in the back, and it sounds like McCoy is working Clark over. Of course, that's not the case. And when we cut back to the back of the truck, I mean, it's fleeting, it's real quick, but you see Clark actually make physical contact, his fist make contact with McCoy for a second. And he says like, I'm sorry, but I need you, out for a minute while I do this, or something to that effect. But yeah, it was cool.
And Clark then takes his I won't take my glasses. He takes his glasses off, and you see him slick his hair back.
Yes.
It's kind of interesting. I mean, it's not like Superman and Clark have different hairstyles. In the early first season, they did. Superman never had the spit curl, but his hair was a little more roughed up. If you think back, didn't last very long. Even his voice was different from Clark's early on. But here, I don't know why he did that. I don't know if that was George Reeves unconsciously slicking back his hair, but it was kind of cute. It was a signal to all of us, like, I'm about to change. So.
Yeah, no, I like that. Again, such a small moment. And I agree. I wonder too, yeah, is that something, I mean, I can't imagine that was in the script, but was that direction? Was that just something he did? Was it something he did to signal the change from Clark to Superman? Or was it just something he did just as George himself? I don't know.
I have to say one more thing, just going back like a minute to the scene where Clark and McCoy are chatting. First of all, it's like a really friendly chat. And at one point, McCoy says, well, I'm going to kill you and the dame anyway. so I might as well tell you about the whole scheme. And it's like he's almost like a Bond villain explaining his plan, but it's such a like a nonchalant and friendly conversation between the two of them. And that's when Clark finally hears the big reveal that it's a computer that's been behind this whole thing. And then you have the key moment where Clark is told, well, that Kelso and Uncle Oscar are going to be blown up. Well, they have to wonder, how does Clark know who they are? How does Clark know who Uncle Oscar is? Unless he was well known, unless he was a well-known professor in Metropolis, you have to assume that. So you don't think too hard about it.
I, yeah, that is a good question. Yeah, I can buy that.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it is tough because there's not enough time where it's like, oh, he could have gone to look up any sort of records per se. But yeah, I mean,
Right.
I think if he's known to some extent, I could get on board with that.
But
And yeah,
no, but that put a time factor on things, and that's what's always good in a plot to suddenly have the clock counting down because now Clark had a sense of urgency. He had to go rescue them. That's why, as you said, he distracted McCoy and knocked him out, changed to Superman.
yeah, no, that sense of urgency is always critical. And so, of course, he makes it to Uncle Oscar's place in time. And again, like I said earlier, you have Oscar participating in his own rescue where he sticks out his foot to trip the other accomplice here. And I like this bit too, where Oscar talks about how like he can't figure out, how Mr. Kelso was tricked essentially into assisting with these robberies, and that he believes that the machine itself would find a way to stop them. And Superman
Yes.
has no time for any of that. But the idea is brought up by Oscar in that moment. And again, it proves true because when Superman flies back to stop the truck, it's already been stopped because the directions from Mr. Kelso had sent it down this one-way street, and there's a police officer waiting there, and Nosy and Lois are standing outside of the truck. So I like that, even the machine, Oscar played a part in his rescue, and the machine itself aided as well.
Well, it's almost like, as you said, artificial intelligence, that Mr. Kelso learned what was going on and then decided to trap the criminals by routing them down a one-way street the wrong way. Couple of things to say about that. First is that you mentioned the exchange between Superman and Professor Quinn. And so Professor Quinn is basically saying, you don't have to rush off, Superman. Mr. Kelso has fouled up the villains. As you said, Superman doesn't have time for that. He doesn't even understand what he's talking about. But later, when at the very end of the scene, I know you're going to get to it, but Quinn says to Clark, he says, didn't I tell you that Mr. Kelso didn't I tell you Mr. Kelso was taking care of them? But he had told Superman that, not Clark. So that's a little bit of a flub. I have to say one more thing. The flying scenes in this episode were great. You don't see them again in the next seasons. But there's one thing that happens here that doesn't happen in any other episode, and that is Superman flying. He looks down, he sees what's happened with Lois and Nosy and the policeman, and he stops. He stops in midair. You can still see his hair being brushed by the wind. He stops. You never see that. And I thought that was really cool. I mean, he's hovering up there. I don't know, about the different Superman artists from the Silver Age. Wayne Boring used to have Superman running on air and sometimes stopping in midair. Now, Superman is horizontal, but it reminded me of that. He stops in midair. You never see that in any other episode. So I thought that was really cool.
I will admit, Oscar saying to Clark, I told you earlier, I did not clock that. So thank you for pointing that out. But I did notice the stopping in midair. And that was striking because you don't see that. And I was like, oh, wow. And it makes perfect sense. Like he's flying to perform this rescue and then he stops because, again, the truck has already been stopped and they're outside with the police officer. Yeah. It was great. And then we have, again, that wrap up scene with Lois and Clark and Oscar at the apartment with the machine, and Lois questioning whether it actually could deduce Superman's secret identity. And Clark has a remark about, he could just be someone very dull, right?
Right.
And what was her retort to that?
Her retort to
Yeah.
that? I forget exactly what she says,
Something
but
about he would know about Dull or like something like something like
yeah,
that.
you would know about Dull, and she gives them like a sneer, and that's the end of them. Then they leave. But yeah, but I remember Uncle Oscar says to Lois, "Oh, Superman wouldn't like that, to have Mr. Kelso figure out his secret identity." So, but then what happens?
Yeah. And then after they leave, though, he does ask the machine the question, and the tape prints out, and Uncle Oscar breaks the fourth wall as he looks at the camera to the audience and just says, he's reading it. Wouldn't you like to know?
His glasses off, yeah.
Yeah. Which, I don't know. When he says to Clark earlier in that scene, I told you, I mean, was it a flub or does Kelso know? And he's just trying to spare himself a trip to the mountains.
Well, but it was Oscar talking to Clark. I don't know. You leave it to your imagination. Um, but the question is, does Kelso know? Does Mr. Kelso know? And that's a question for the ages. You never find out. It's a shame that Kelso didn't return, perhaps with Quinn in another episode. But a lot of things didn't return.
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, and presumably, like, we don't know exactly what data was fed into the machine about Superman, but there was a remark about, his known acquaintances and things like that. And it's like, if you factor in known sightings and flight paths and again, the people that he's constantly associated with, the time he arrived in the city, like, depending on the data that's been fed into it, presumably a device this advanced maybe could figure it out.
All that Kelso did, though, was you have to assume that he didn't figure out Clark's identity. What he did know and what he did tell the bad guys effectively was that you can stop Superman by telling him his secret identity. But that's as far as it went.
Right.
And that's all the information that Kelso had. It was powerful information and a devastating thing for Clark. But at that point, he didn't know his secret identity, and maybe at the end of the episode, he didn't either. But it leaves you with a question, which is a nice way to end the episode. So,
yeah, no, it was a fun little button for the episode, and no, I agree. I think that's what built the mystery with this was, when you had McCoy and you had Nosy after they knocked out Oscar, it wasn't, we're going to ask the machine who Superman is, but it's like, we're going to have the machine tell us how to stop him. Right. And to your point, it's like the way to stop him is to say that we know your identity and we're going to expose it.
Because that's all they needed. They needed to stop Superman. First, McCoy needed to stop Superman so that Nosy would remain in the gang because he was ready to bolt. And they wanted to stop him so they could commit however many more crimes that they had. It didn't seem like there were many more because McCoy tells Clark, this is all that we're going to steal. So
yeah, they were ready to retire with their loot. But yeah, this was so much fun. The last thing we do here with these episodes is we rate them on a scale of 1 to 5 fedoras. Of course, 5 being the best. So how many fedoras, Bruce, would you give this one?
I would give it 4. You don't have half fedoras because that wouldn't work. It wouldn't work.
Yeah, half a fedora doesn't really, but we have had halves in the past because sometimes we're really torn, so we would allow a half.
Well, I'll give it a 4 if I'm allowed half a fedora. I'd give it a 4.5 because you have to leave the 5s. You have 5 fedoras, right? I've heard this before. Yeah, you have to leave that for the panic in the skies and the face, and the voice, and maybe a few others. So I'll give it a 4, 4.5, whatever's allowed.
Halves are allowed, so we'll say for our pal Lou Koza, he's been so generously tabulating all the scores for me. So to make it easy for him, 4.5. We won't make him pick.
I know him from Jim Nolt's group.
Yes.
So,
so Bruce's score is 4.5. I'm going to go a 4 for me, a solid 4. Like, I really enjoyed this episode, and again, especially coming off of Panic in the Sky, we were riding high coming off of that, and this could have felt like a letdown, but it was really solid. And again, intriguing. The exterior locations, I think, just gave it a different feel. Like you said, you had the secret identity in jeopardy. It kind of felt like we were in that season 1 territory. Yeah, really enjoyable episode. And I thank you so much for sharing your passion and insight and joining me for this discussion.
It's a pleasure. I have to say that at Jim Nult's super gatherings, when we get together, we, as much as we can, we talk about the episodes. We talk about the trivia and all the different aspects. And this was like that. And this was great. I really appreciate the opportunity. I thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. And I'm sure that your fellow George Reeves fans, will enjoy your appearance here and everything that you brought to this. So I thank you. I thank you, audience. Make sure you come back next week for another all new episode. And until then, remember, only Superman can do super things. This podcast is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP to save 10% on your order. That's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions. It helps support the show, too. Be sure to check out our sister podcast series, Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey, a weekly exploration of Superman's vast 85-year mythology, available wherever you get podcasts. Please join us on social media, become a patron, and subscribe, rate, and review today. Links are in the show notes. Thank you all.